Susan Anderson, or Doc Susie as she was called, was the first woman doctor in the Frasier Valley. She practiced medicine from 1907 to 1956, treating ranchers, loggers, and railroaders. For a long time, she was the only doctor in the community. Doc Susie practiced medicine well into her 80s and died in Denver on April 16, 1960, at the age of 90. She is buried in Cripple Creek, Colorado. In 1997, Doc Susie was inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame, an honor that goes to women who have made significant contributions to Colorado. An important source for this story is the self-published book by Virginia Cornell entitled Doc Susie, The True Story of a Country Physician in the Colorado Rockies. When Doc Susie first moved to Frasier, there were about 12 families living in the community. Ruggedness was the town's principal trait. Frasier still is a small town and at one time had the dubious distinction of being called the icebox of the nation. A couple other points of interest is that West Portal is now called Winter Park, and to this day, people in the Frasier Valley still refer to spring as mud season. And now, let us go back to 1947 as Doc Susie reflects back on her life. Doc Susie, aka volunteer Linda Batlin.
Call Doc Susie. That's what they would say about me, Susan Anderson, MD. I've been a doctor here in Frasier, going on, maybe the only woman doctor for going on 40 years now. But when I look back, my memories of those first years are the most vivid. I'd like to tell you how I came here to Frasier in the first place. I was born in Indiana in 1870. My parents divorced when I was a child, and that's how my younger brother John and I went to live with Pa on a farm near Wichita, Kansas. We grew up there and graduated from Wichita High School. Then Pa moved us all to Cripple Creek, Colorado, because there was a big gold discovery there. Pa ended up becoming a successful businessman. My great-grandfather was a doctor, or so I'm told, and that's what Pa wanted to be, but he never had the time to go to school. He used to say, "One of my children will grow up and be a doctor for me." And that is what I did. I attended the University of Michigan Medical College. It was a pretty good school and one of the few to admit women at the time. I remember how I hated dissection, but I got through it all and I graduated from there in 1897. In my last year, I developed a bad cough. I was diagnosed as having a slight tubercular condition. The dean of the school said I should go back to Cripple Creek to do my residency where the air was dry and cool and my health could improve rather than staying in a humid climate like Michigan or Pennsylvania where I wanted to go. I wonder what my life would have been like if this hadn't happened, but I don't even think of it anymore. There's really no point. My once close relationship with Pa had grown cool, especially after he remarried when I was in high school, and it didn't get any better when I returned to Cripple Creek. Cripple Creek was a rough and tumble town and place, but kind of exciting. Things seemed to hold such promise for me. My health was getting stronger, and it was the turn of a new century, the 20th century. The miners seemed to accept having a woman sew up their barroom wounds with surprising gentleness, and my practice was growing. I kept it there for 3 years. My younger brother Johnny was there, and we became closer friends than we had ever been before. I even met the man of my dreams, W.R. We were to be married in March of 1900. But then the nightmare happened. It was all within a few days. W.R. talked to Pa, and I never found out what Pa told him, but he left me at the altar with no warning. A few days later, he returned my photographs, the end of a vain hope. And then my dearest Johnny came down with influenza. It turned to pneumonia, and he died. There was nothing I could do to save him. I felt so useless. I felt my life was all in vain, and I didn't care if I lived or died. Well, after that, Pa moved his new family to Oakland, California, and I left Cripple Creek. I went to Denver and tried to set up a practice there. but I didn't have much luck. Folks weren't accepting of having a woman doctor there. I went north of Greeley and found a similar situation. I took a job as a nurse and I kept it for 6 years. Oh, Greeley was a dismal place. My tubercular condition gradually got worse, and by the fall of 1907, it was quite bad. I had been putting in a lot of long hours, and I was under a lot of stress. There was a diphtheria epidemic going on, and it just took so much out of me. I remember taking a vacation in August, just a few months earlier, over on the western slope in Frasier. I remember that the air was crisp, the valleys were green, surrounded by the tall mountains. I was 37 years old, and I decided that's where I would go to live or die, however it turned out. I still remember that train road over the Moffat Road in early winter, crossing mountains over 11,000 feet high. I met people that day who would be my life for years to come. The conductor, George Barnes, helped me and my little dog Poochie onto the train. He said there was a long, hard trip and there wouldn't be much in Frasier when I got there. He said it was so cold there that people had to leave town just to get warm. But I was determined to go. The train climbed slowly and steeply, taking on water now and then when it stopped. We headed into a blizzard and it was bitter cold. The train compartment was filled with young men, mostly Swedes, heading to the various logging camps to work. And it was so cold that the pot-bellied stove there could barely keep things warm. I noticed a young blonde Swede, a couple of rows in front of me, who kept rubbing his eye. Well, the next time the train stopped to take on water, I asked what was wrong. He indicated he had something stuck in his eye. So I took a clean cloth and I carefully cleaned it out and removed the cinder. He was so grateful. It had been so painful for him. He said he would do something nice for me someday because I wouldn't take payment for my services. His name was Axel Bergstrom. When we stopped for lunch at the top in the town of Corona, I met the engineer, George Schreiber. He had a nose like Cyrano, but he and his wife Grace would be lifelong friends. Well, after lunch, the train started down the other side of the mountain with the snowplow trying to clear the path ahead of us and everyone hoping there wouldn't be an avalanche to block the way. I was so tired and weak I could barely control my coughing. We got through the worst of it and descended below timberline. I fell asleep, and when I awoke, we were in Frasier. My train was the last to make it over the top for several days because of that blizzard. At first I stayed with my friends Charlie and Cora Warner, who ran the general store. I met them the summer before. I stayed in their house. Cora, I didn't want anyone to know I was a doctor at first, because if I couldn't cure myself, how could I cure anyone else? But Cora gave me a gift. It was a rock, or a spinster's friend, that I would heat on the stove and put between the sheets at night to keep my feet warm. Well, after a short time, I moved to my own shack just east of the tracks, and there, through plenty of rest, cold, dry air, good, healthy food, I gradually regained my strength. I would work in the Warner store to help repay them for all the kindnesses they were showing me. Now, I must say that when I was young, I was considered to be quite attractive. As a result, a lot of young men would stop by the store, but I didn't pay them much mind. By spring, I was feeling much stronger. Now, spring in Frasier is mud season, when the snow melts and runs off. The snow melts near the warm ground first, then the crust of the snow gives way from the weight of itself. Sometimes, if you look out over the great white sea of a field, you can see the snow settle. Whoosh! That is spring. That's when the lumberjacks came down from the hills to take jobs at the mill, and the cowboys came up from the plains to look for jobs as ranch hands. Now, it's hard to keep a secret in a small town, so word got around that I was a doctor. One morning I was at the store and a young cowboy came running up waving a blood-stained hat shouting, "Ma'am, it's Dave. He's all cut up. He got cut up in the barbed wire. He's butchered pretty bad. Ma'am, folks say you're a doctor. I need your help. Dave's all I got." Well, I couldn't refuse to help him. I asked him where his friend was. "Ma'am, he's down at the corral and he can't be moved." Is Dave your partner?" "No, ma'am, he's my horse." And that is how I met my first patient in Frasier. Now, all country doctors had to work on animals from time to time. I went home, got cleaned up, got my medical bag. When I got down to the corral, word had gotten around, so there was a crowd down there to watch me sew up that horse. Well, that old horse, he wouldn't hold still. He kicked over the bucket of hot water. People were shouting at me the advice to do this or do that. But I carefully cleaned out his wounds and stitched up his cuts. But you know those stitches never lasted. That critter just pulled them out with his teeth. But I pulled him through. But you know, I never did get that young cowboy's name. Well, after that, people would stop by the store asking advice on this or that, and my practice started to grow. Oh, there was another doctor in town, Doc Albers, but if he wasn't available, people would come and see me. I treated toothaches, bellyaches, cuts, bruises, other assorted ailments. I never believed in painkillers or chloroform, not even a snort of whiskey when I pulled a tooth. I remember telling a young man that he could cuss because that was the only painkiller he was getting out of me. I didn't keep painkillers or drugs around my house. I was afraid someone might break in to get them. What had happened in Cripple Creek, I didn't want it to happen again. My remedies were simple. For example, if one of you came to me with a sore throat, I would paint it with Dobell solution. Burned like fire going down, I'm told, but it cured the sore throat. Now, one evening, someone came to the door and said there was a baby up in Arrow, one of the lumber camps, that was awful sick. I had to come right away. Said there was a freight train going uphill in 15 minutes. Well, I got my medical bag and caught the train because you don't want to keep an uphill freight waiting. When I got off at the depot at Arrow, I found John and Hannah Knutson waiting for me. They were a young immigrant couple and could barely speak English. But there was another woman there who translated for me. Hannah was holding a baby in her arms. I took the baby and examined it and realized that the child had an advanced case of scurvy. They had called me too late. There was nothing I could do to save the child, who was called Agnes. I gave her back to Hannah. I told her that Agnes probably only had a few hours left to live, and she was only a year old. Hannah herself was pregnant again. I talked to her about this time eating fresh fruit and vegetables and getting the proper medical care, and not to worry about the cost. Well, they seemed to understand and walked away into the night carrying the baby, and I sat down waiting for a return train to Frasier with a heavy heart. When I got home that night, I was exhausted. I collapsed into bed. I couldn't have been asleep for more than 15 minutes when there was a pounding on the door. It was Harry Hollingsworth. He said the neighbor boy, Dalton Irby, was real sick with pneumonia. I had to come with him now. Pneumonia was a big killer in the Frasier Valley. Just the mention of the disease brought back memories of my dear brother John and how pneumonia had taken him. But Harry brought me back to the present, saying I had to go with him now. So he took me and my little dog, who I took everywhere with me, to their place just outside of town. I examined the boy. He was burning up with fever, but they had called me in time. There was a chance I could save Dalton. I treated him in a simple but effective manner. I took a wash tub and opened all the doors and windows so lots of cold fresh air would come in. Then I completely undressed the boy and wrapped him in a rolled blanket and placed him in the wash tub and proceeded to pour boiling water over him and let it drip into the tub. This caused steam to form and produced moist, warm air that he took into his lungs. Well, the family had to keep working, keeping the fire going and the water boiling and bringing in more wood. They thought this was mighty strange, but I told them that this was the only way it could work. And of course, Poochie just slept by the stove all night. But by morning, the fever broke. Dalton was going to be all right. I could tell his family that. I went home after breakfast feeling exhilarated with life, like I could make a difference here. And that's when I decided I would make Frasier my home. Well, after that, more and more people would be banging on my door. I had one of those telephone contraptions for a while, but it was more trouble than was worth. Besides, everyone knew where I lived and could come and get me if they needed me, which they did, anytime, day or night. I would see my patients no matter what, even if it was 50 degrees below zero or colder, which was often the case in those bitter cold Frasier winters. But I dressed like everyone else did, with lots of petticoats and long johns and heavy boots. Well, folks know I don't like to go out at night so much anymore, so they try not to come see me then. I never owned a horse or an automobile. I got where I needed to any way I could. I tried skis. I never was much of a skier. I used snowshoes, horses, sleighs. Sometimes the blizzards were so bad I couldn't even see the horse in front of the sleigh. And there was a train. The engineers would stop and take me out anywhere I needed to, up and down the line. I delivered babies in kitchens and in tents. Of course, I always wanted to get the mothers down to Colorado General and Denver, but it doesn't always work out that way. I remember one winter, I was called out to the ranch, the Pole Creek Ranch of Carl and Della Just. Della was having a baby. It turned out to be a difficult birth, but while I was working with Della, I noticed one of the other children, Rudy, was complaining of a stomachache, but I had to concentrate on Della. She finally delivered the baby late in that night, and then I examined Rudy and realized that he had appendicitis, and I'd have to get him down to Denver right away. Now, I am a doctor, not a surgeon. I couldn't operate on him there. Well, Carl, the husband, had to take care of Della and the rest of the family, so I took Rudy myself on the train. There was a bad snowstorm, and the train had trouble plowing through the drifts going up over the Corona Road, and we were hoping that we wouldn't get stuck, but we made it. I got Rudy to the hospital in time. He had his operation, and he was just fine. And I even got to scrub in on the surgery. Well, I never made a fortune by doctoring. Folks in Grand County were so poor. People paid me what they thought it was worth. I never even sent anyone a bill. But I was comfortable enough. I had regained my health. I had a free pass on the train. And I had my own home. Now, that's kind of interesting how that happened, or I think so. In 1913, William R. Freeman, a big shot with the Denver and Salt Lake Railroad, came to see me and told me that they were putting a road in where my house stood, and it was in the DNSL right-of-way. Well, the man just about hyperventilated in the thin air when he told me that I had to get out. He gave me till spring to move. I guess he thought I would get hysterical, but I didn't. Well, I went to treat another lumberjack that afternoon, and on the way back I stopped in to check on another patient who lived on a nice ranch. The rancher said that he was selling up. It was just too rough up here for him and his family. I happened to admire his hay barn. He said the new owners wouldn't be using it, and I could have it as payment for my services. I looked it over, and I told him I'd get back to him on that. When I got back to town, news of Freeman's ultimatum had spread around. Some men from the sawmill came to see me. They said it was shameful the way Freeman treated me, and that they would give me, or rather charge me $1 to make it legal, my own plot of land just west of the tracks because of everything I had done for the mill. Well, I accepted. And I accepted the barn and to have it moved over to this new plot and have a new roof put on it, one that slanted like this so the snow would just slide off and I wouldn't have to climb up on the top and shovel it. Axel and a bunch of loggers came by the next Sunday and they went and dismantled the barn and moved it to my new lot and then rebuilt the barn in my house and put that new roof on. Well, I didn't want any of the newfangled conveniences like electricity or running water, so the work was done in mostly one day. Now, I also happened to have a pane of glass with an Indiana rose etched into it that I had been saving. One of the carpenters cut a hole in the front door and fitted the pane of glass into it. Since I didn't need any running water or anything, the work was done in mostly one day. Oh, it turned into a festive occasion. The women brought lots of food and there was singing and dancing at the end of the day. A large fireplace was added later, and so I moved into the home of my dreams, complete with an Indiana rose in the door. Now, I never did marry. I suppose I could have if I hadn't said poo so many times and brushed people away. I actually wanted to marry and have my own child, but when World War I broke out, I saw young men marching off to war and many not coming back. I thought it was blessed to be without. But I still did not want to be alone. Gossip was such a pastime then. People would talk about me so. They said I was man crazy, that I enjoyed treating men over women, and I enjoyed doing that pneumonia cure business with the blankets. But the men in the Frasier Valley outnumbered the women. There were men everywhere it seemed, but no one was the right man for me to marry. There were gorgeous looking men working the timber, but the illusion faded as soon as one of them opened their mouths, and I found the company of a good book more enjoyable. Now, that Ben Jones, he was different. He was one of the logging crew bosses, well-dressed, good-looking, and suave. Oh, he flirted with me something terrible, but I saw a lot of husband potential in him. And he was a wonderful dancer. Oh, I loved dancing. And everyone knew it. When I treated patients in the logging camp, they put on a dance for me afterwards because they knew how much I liked it. And then one barn dance in town, Ben was there and he danced with me all night. That set the tongues wagging. But then I was called out, a couple of months later, I was called out to his logging camp. I was kind of eager to go, but I had to treat a child. But that's when I found out that he was married. The child I was called to treat was his own. I was so hurt. Ben drove me home afterwards, and on the way he put his arm around me and tried to hug me. I just pushed him away and jumped out of the sleigh with my medical bag and walked home with a sprained ankle. But the way the gossips had it was, they said I tried to cuddle up to him knowing he was a married man, and he pushed me out to save his honor. Now, something not many people know about me is all through my life I have had a passion for roses. Now, I know this sounds contradictory, that here I am, this tough pioneer woman doctor, with a fondness for delicate roses. I would embroider them on pillowcases. I would take magazines and catalogs and calendars and cut pictures out and plaster them on my wall. And my favorite daydream was someday to go back to Indiana where I was born and start my own garden of roses. Now, I'm the kind of person who collects everything, even a sliver of soap. I say everything's going to be needed someday. You should never throw anything out. there were all kinds of items, nails, broken axe handles, anything you can imagine. But a lot of these items came in handy. Well, when my house was built, I had my old shack moved over and used that as an outbuilding. I guess you could say that my office was cluttered with boxes and papers, and people thought I was a bit eccentric. But some patients, especially the newcomers in town, found this rather unnerving. Well, one man said that if he was dying or very sick, he'd probably be dead by the time I cleared off my examining table. But this isn't true. I just examined patients on my bed. People said I wasn't clean, that my instruments were dirty and there was dust on my needles. But no one ever got an infection from one of my dressings. No one. In fact, just a few years ago, back in 1941, a military train stopped in Frasier because a young soldier had rammed his fist through the window and was seriously hurt. They brought the young man out onto the platform, and I carefully cleaned out his wounds and stitched him up till he could get further attention at the Naval Hospital in California. And the doctors there said I did a fine job. And the doctors down at Denver General, the Colorado General, always praised my dressings and my ability to make accurate diagnoses. And when I went to deliver a baby, I would wash, scrub, wash my hair, change clothes. I was shining clean. Now, if there is one thing in life that I do not tolerate, it is drinking liquor. I believe that alcohol caused a lot of the problems and illnesses that I treated. So I was glad when Prohibition was passed in 1920. In 1924, the Grand County Sheriff, Mark Fletcher, deputized me, and I would go with him to nab bootlickers. And in fact, this one time, now this was with the previous sheriff, Sheriff West. We went to this one fellow's house right here in town because the sheriff had suspected him. Well, we knocked on the door, the fellow came out, his name was George Karch, and closed the door behind him, and he said, he didn't know anything about bootlicking, and we couldn't come in because his missus was awful sick. Fiddlesticks, I said. Well, the sheriff said he was in luck because I happened to be a doctor. We pushed that fellow aside, went in, and there lying in the bed was the missus, with the covers pulled up tight around her chin. And this was August. I thought she looked fairly healthy, and her hair was neatly combed for someone feeling so poorly. "Ma'am, what's the matter? I'm a doctor. Can I help you?" She just shook her head and clung on to those covers. Well, Sheriff West went over, pulled back the covers, and there, next to that fully clothed woman, were 6 bottles of whiskey. Well, that Karch fellow was fined $300 and spent 30 days in jail for that stunt. Now, I happened to tell this story to some federal revenuers when Sheriff Fletcher picked me up one day to take me up St. Louis Creek to check on some fellows from Nebraska who were setting up business there. I had my medical bag, my gun, and my axe with me. I always carry a little gun with me, and just in case any of the boys get kind of funny, but all these years I've never had to use it. Well, we pulled off the road, and there were some other men waiting for us. And there in a clearing were some men bent over a still. There were jugs and barrels lying around. Why, those men were so absorbed in what they were doing, they never heard us coming. The sheriff jumped out and shouted, "You're under arrest!" They were so surprised they didn't move as the treasury agents came in and handcuffed them. They collected what evidence they needed, and then Sheriff Fletcher pointed to me saying he was ready. I picked up my axe and went over to one of the barrels, and whack! The liquor gushed out, and whack and whack, and I hit it until it was empty. Then I went to the jugs and it went whack, whack, whack. Well, those federal agents were laughing so hard that tears were running down their face. They were calling me Carrie Nation. It was mighty satisfying. Well, after that, the sheriff approached me about being Grand County coroner. The current coroner didn't want the job anymore, and the Mafia Tunnel was under construction. It was considered safe for a job of this nature, but it still concerned me. Maybe only 3 men had died directly in the construction, but so many more had died from working underground, sweating, and coming out to temperatures of 20 below and catching pneumonia. No one counted those as tunnel casualties. But Sheriff Fletcher said the county needed a real doctor as coroner. Well, I was in my 50s and didn't have much in the bank, so I submitted my name to the Grand County Commissioners for the post of coroner. But I was talking about the Mafia Tunnel. It took 4 years to build and was touted as the longest in the United States. It was safer than it was a good thing because it was safer than going over Rollins Pass that remained drifted closed for several days in the winter. But all kinds of riffraff were coming into the West Portal to take jobs, and the mills were closing because people went to West Portal to get more money. But even though it was a good thing, it bothered me how much it was costing the taxpayers. Now I know Bill Freeman, that big shot who tried to kick me out of my house, he was behind the scheme to get the Mafia Tunnel Commission formed independent of the railroad, and so the taxpayers would pay for it. But in the summer of 1927, the tunnel was completed. The open ceremonies were to be February 26, 1928, when the first official passenger train would pass through the tunnel from the East Portal, and the tunnel would be turned over to the railroad, the lessee. But this gets into a lot of detail, but I know that Bill Freeman had been sending freight trains through the tunnel for 2 weeks free, and no one was complaining about this. Fred Bonfils from the Post had made a large contribution to the railroad, so this wouldn't be publicized. Well, the only ceremony was over on East Portal, and we were on the west side. Well, whose tunnel was this anyway? The people who did the work and gave 4 years of their lives were not getting credit. There wasn't anyone that didn't either know someone or have someone working the tunnels in some capacity. So my friends and I decided that we would go to the opening ceremonies, but the railroad wouldn't let us walk through the tunnel. Well, Sunday, February 26th rolled around, and everyone went up to West Portal to watch this. Now the schedule was printed in the Post, so we knew when the train would enter the tunnel from the east side. And we listened. As the time grew close, you could feel the excitement in the crowd grow. And finally, there was a rumbling sound in the tunnel, and a puff of smoke came out the mouth. And then the locomotive appeared and came to a stop. But before that, I had made up a sign and pasted it to some boards and put it in a snow bank so that it would be visible when the locomotive stopped. And sure enough, Freeman and Fred Bonfils stepped off onto the platform smiling, but their faces fell when they saw the sign I had made. We built this tunnel, the Post didn't, and the Rocky Mountain News was there to take pictures. Well, one of the most difficult things I've ever gone through was the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. People died so quickly. I was good at treating pneumonia, but I could not help a lot of these people. I felt like I was going from one deathbed to another. I felt so helpless. People were dying so quickly, bodies were just being stacked up by the side of the road. I have never felt anything quite so despairing, and I hope that no one ever has to see anything like this again. But Grand County saw some hard times after the loss of jobs from the railroad and the Great Depression. I've seen many changes over these 40 years, but I don't regret anything. Oh, I sometimes thought I would go back to Indiana and start that rose garden. I even started to go back once, but I came back because Frasier really is my home. This is where I belong and where my story has been lived. Well, now I reckon I've rattled on long enough, and you folks may want to stand up and stretch, but before you do any of you have any questions for me?